And finally, I'm going to wrap up the show with a short little segment about, those are some of my ideas about how I think the left should go. And I guess I went about them in kind of a roundabout way, but I would say the real takeaways is we shouldn't target people like Joe Rogan, not because he doesn't deserve it, but because we should be building up left infrastructure to target people further up the culture war food chain to where it's no longer about culture anymore. It's about economics. We need to target the economic Joe Rogans, the economic powerhouses, not the media powerhouses, because the culture is downstream of the economy, contrary to the right-wing talking point that politics are downstream of culture. That's BS. Culture is downstream of the economy, and that is why we should not target Joe Rogan. And then secondly, I really want to emphasize that debating is fine, but what is mistaken for debating on YouTube by left-wing sophists is actually extremely damaging to the left-wing movement. It's not productive whatsoever. And then third, I really want to emphasize that just straight up, I don't really consider you a leftist if you're an American, especially, who supports the U.S. military intervention abroad. I don't think that constitutes a left-wing position. And in virtually everywhere else in the world, supporting the U.S. military would make you be seen as extremely right-wing, frankly. So that's where we're at with those. And I mean, I guess the ultimate point is if you're on the left, you need to be against war. Like, that's just basic ass stuff. Socialist parties showed during World War I that they fail when they support bourgeois warfare. And so I want to give a perspective that people can look through the world through to kind of develop their politics. And, the other day I was watching Seinfeld and I had this thought, like, what would an ancient person think if they were watching this show? What would they think?
Why'd you put the bananas in there?
George likes the bananas!
So let him have bananas on the side! All right!
If an ancient Egyptian was watching Seinfeld, and, I don't think they would get it. That kind of goes without saying. There's so much stuff on it that'd just be completely over their heads. But I was watching the episode with the soup Nazi, and I'm like, an ancient Egyptian could relate to having good soup. And then I started thinking about, like, well, how would an ancient Egyptian get soup? How are different ways to distribute soup? Right now, we have a very specific type of way to eat soup. You pay money for ingredients, and then you make the soup with the ingredients, and then you eat it. Why is the money involved? We take that for granted. We just assume money has to be involved when you're procuring supplies for food or whatnot, but they don't have to be involved. We could think of other systems. What if every month everyone got vouchers that they exchanged for like full meals? Like, say you get 30 vouchers a month, and then, let's say every meal, you get 90 vouchers a month. That would function a lot different than money. Like, if you exchange a voucher, get a meal, and then, people might say, well, that's still money, right? But no, the voucher would go away. It wouldn't enter the economic circulation, so it would be quite different. And there'd be a lot of different ramifications for using that. Another example is the Incans in South America before in pre-Columbian, like Andean cultures, they had a much more distributive model for their economy than Europeans did. It was not as market-based. It was the surplus resources were collected by a central authority and then distributed. Sure, there were like exchanges. It wasn't like a completely market-free system. Markets are very efficient, especially, in a post-feudal industrial like situation. A market is very effective, but that's been like a little sliver of our history. And before capitalism really developed, we didn't use the market as a mechanism for distribution. I mean, we exchanged through the market, but like, it's not like, when I go to work, I maybe buy a breakfast bagel in the morning. I don't do this every day, but just as an example, I go to work, buy a breakfast bagel, and then in the afternoon I buy, I don't know, a sandwich, and then I get home, and then there's groceries here to make dinner. They didn't have that conception of food distribution until relatively recently. So I guess what I really want to emphasize is the key part, absolute key to Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Prachanda, Costanzaism is looking at things in the past, or combining things from two different pasts, looking at things from the past and present, past and future, future and present. Looking at those realities, both real and imagined, and learning what is possible. And I don't mean getting spun off into some fantasy land. It's very easy to do this, but it's actually the opposite of what I'm asking, is to be like, oh, I envision this perfect world where everyone lives in these 32 unit complexes with this type of store and that type of thing, because that level of planning is just never going to exist. You're basically imagining worlds that do not and will not exist because they aren't compatible with the material conditions. What you want to do is look at the past and future and imagine futures and the present compared to the past and blah, 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 and figure out why things are the way they are, why things were the way they were, and what conditions would make the world a better place. That's what you should be looking for, because there's a lot to learn from the past. And I just want to caution, like, this is what I'll close on. There is a hubris that comes with modernity to think all of the problems from before, we are solving them in a modern way. We have the tools now. We're doing it. We're pushing the modernity button, and we're solving all these problems. But a lot of problems have been solved before. For example, the Aztecs had a really robust and complex agriculture and farming system where they used canals with little water, and they kind of made self-irrigating systems that were highly efficient. Europeans didn't have this system, and it was functionally lost. I mean, some people still practice this mode of farming, but it is not the dominant form of farming. It was lost with European colonialism. That didn't have to be lost. That was a happenstance consequence of the material conditions. So the goal of my ideology is to look at things that the past has lost. Imagine things that can happen in the future. and figure out what conditions allowed that to exist in the past and how to make those conditions allow that thing to exist in the future. It always has to come back to the conditions of the time it existed in. Things don't just happen randomly. They exist because of specific conditions.